Good morning to everyone here in the United States, and good afternoon to those of you joining us from Europe. I'm Richard Morningstar. I'm the founding chairman of the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council and a former ambassador to the European Union many moons ago, I might add. And I have the pleasure of welcoming all of you to day 2 of the Atlantic Council's Central Europe Week, which is our annual series celebrating U.S. Central European relations and highlighting how the United States and Central Europe can together help to shape transatlantic relations. And this year, we're obviously hosting the conference, a much different situation than a year ago. Russia's war in Ukraine has really changed a lot of assumptions. And one of the areas that's absolutely critical now, of course, is the energy situation in Europe. And that's why we're all really just thrilled to have with us for this conversation European Commissioner for Energy, Kadri Simpson, to talk about some of these extremely timely questions. So thank you for joining us, Commissioner Simpson, and let me go directly to you with the first question, which is maybe more in general. How do you see the European energy situation right now? It's more than that winter is approaching. Winter is here. And how do you see the situation for this winter? And just as important, and in some ways even more important, how do you see it for next winter?
Good afternoon from Brussels, and indeed winter is here. It's December, but we have been lucky with very mild temperatures so far. It's clear that Russia's invasion on Ukraine impacts Europe's energy landscape, and the most affected countries are the ones who are most dependent on Russian supplies. So countries in our eastern and central part. And these are exactly the same countries that were impacted when Russia first time cut off their gas supplies in 2009. So we learned our lessons from that time, and amazingly but this summer, this autumn, several crucial infrastructure projects came into operation. The pipelines that, for example, connect Norwegian gas fields via Denmark to Poland, interconnection between Poland and Slovakia, Poland and Lithuania, also necessary interconnection that connects Bulgaria with Greece, and by that also with Azeri alternative gas supplies. So all these alternative supplies, and on top of that, relatively solid LNG terminal network has allowed us to replace partially Russian gas. But of course, we still receive some natural gas via pipelines through Ukraine and Turkish route still from Russia. So we are prepared that Russia can continue its manipulation. And for us, the necessary buffer is our underground gas storage. In Europe, we do have lots of geological storage sites, well depleted gas fields, salt caverns, and our underground gas storage right now is full. We started filling this in the middle of the summer, and this was in many member states 100% full only 2 weeks ago. Now our aim is to save energy so that we will not finish this winter, not finish this heating season with empty storage. And if we will manage to cut our gas consumption significantly, that means that we are better prepared for the next filling season that starts already next spring. And to avoid situation where our companies will compete with each other, we will help them, we will pool together European demand, and we will do it via our joint gas purchasing platform so that we can reach out to trusted partners. And United States for sure has been one of the dominant alternative supplier for us by increasing their LNG shipments significantly. And of course, we have also received pipeline gas from our trusted partners from Norway, from Algeria and Azerbaijan. And by doing so, yes, we are safe for this winter, but it doesn't mean that we don't have to accelerate our green transition. And of course, it means that savings make the difference. And so far in September, October, November, our companies, our governments have saved gas significant volumes already.
I suppose some of the risks for next winter would be that maybe there'll be no Russian gas coming to help fill storage. There may be greater demand in Asia, other issues. Are you confident that some of the steps that you have just talked about, getting alternative gas supplies, reducing demand, and so forth, can overcome those risks, and that you'll end up being okay for next winter?
That's very true that we have been able to attack so big volumes of LNG also due to the fact that China has prolonged its lockdown measures, and the Chinese LNG demand has been significantly lower than in previous years. And we have to be ready that one day Russia cuts gas supplies and does it in the way that it impacts many member states. It has cut already gas in the way that 13 EU member states are either partially or fully left without long-term contracts. And that by doing so, this is clear that Russian Gazprom is not a trusted partner. Now, we also know that it is impossible to replace 100% Russian gas with alternative suppliers. That means that we need also other alternative parallel actions. I was already mentioning fuel switch, and indeed this year, 2022, has been a record year for Europe's solar industry, for example. We have installed 40 gigawatts of new solar installations, and by doing so, securing several hours of our electricity consumption with alternatives. And each hour where our consumption is covered by renewables is helping us to save gas, because then gas-fired power plants are not needed. And then, of course, there are several actions how we can save our gas consumption. And one of the priorities for that is renovation activity, because as I was mentioning, winters are extremely difficult for Europe due to the fact that 40% of our annual gas consumption is spent to heat our homes. And if our homes are renovated, if the consumption is lower, then of course, step by step, we don't need these billions of cubic meters that we so far received from Russia.
Thank you. Let me go into another area. This relates to Central Europe, which of course is the subject of what we're doing this week. And you know, the issue that's come to the forefront certainly over the last several days is the oil price cap, and also discussions in Europe about a gas price cap as well, which hasn't been finalized yet. And there seems to be a debate between Central and Eastern European countries and other member states as to what the level of the price caps ought to be, both with respect to oil and gas. And frankly, it seems on the oil side that the G7, the EU, the US have been mostly concerned about stabilizing oil markets and preventing inflation, which are, you know, obviously important goals. But it also seems that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that reducing Russian revenues on oil sort of has taken a back seat, given on the oil side the $60 price cap. Having said all that, how do you see the differences within Europe as to what the levels should ultimately be? And I know that in the oil side, it'll be reconsidered again in January or February. And is there a potential problem of unity within the EU being affected by these differences?
In EU, we need unity. We need that all 27 will agree when we implement sanctions. And so far, we have already implemented 8 packages of sanctions against Russian commodities. And when we discussed oil price cap, then it was not for us because EU's ban on importing Russian seaborne crude oil was adopted already in our 6th package, and we don't receive any seaborne crude oil since yesterday. And way earlier, our company stopped buying Russian crude oil due to the reputational risks. Then, and that explains that when we discussed the oil price cap, then we wanted to avoid the situation where Russia will be able to reroute their cargoes to third countries. And if they will do so, and if they need European vessels and European insurance on these vessels, then they have to give these crude oil shipments away with significant discounts. And then we discussed what is the fair price so that Russia still delivers crude oil to the third countries who for sure will need supplies, and what is the level that cuts significantly Russian revenues. And when it took a little bit longer than expected, then the reason was that some governments believed that we are too generous with the level of 60. But this is not the only action that cuts Russian revenues. I think that even more important is our sanction on technology. And international agencies are saying that our sanctions on technology are already working, and Russia will not be able to reach the same production levels, both on oil and gas, that it had before it started this unjustified war against Ukraine. And that means that if they can produce significantly smaller volumes, the revenues automatically will be lower too. But European Union as such still allows some oil import from Russia through pipeline. This is Southern Druzhba pipeline. And the reason is that if we introduce sanctions, then they have to have stronger impact to Russian economy than ours. And we do have some Central European countries who don't have yet valid alternative for that pipeline route that they so far have received from Russia through this Druzhba pipeline.
Yeah, no, I think that's really an interesting response and a very helpful response. That seems to me maybe the best answer is what you just said, that don't worry so much exactly about how much Russian oil revenues decline. All the other sanctions are really having a major effect on Russia's war-making capability. Let me go to another issue. In the last week or two, there's been a lot of it seems like a lot of criticism from Europe. There certainly was from President Macron when he came to Washington about prices of American LNG, about our Inflation Reduction Act, and all of the various subsidies and grants and so forth and so on that will go to American green transition projects. And it may be putting Europe at a disadvantage. How serious do you think these issues are? And do you think this is something by the US and the EU working together? And you might talk about the importance of the relationship. Is this something that we can overcome? I mean, these are serious issues. I dealt with similar kinds of things 20 years ago, and we try, work them through.
I strongly believe that our cooperation has never been stronger than it is right now between EU and United States. And as I was mentioning earlier, we would have not been able to fill our underground gas storage unless United States would have not stepped up its export volumes. And despite the fact that we have paid very high price in August, our LNG price was almost 10 times higher than 2 years ago. well, we have at least taken care of our security of supply aspect. But I do believe that that cooperation also means that we have constant contact, and you mentioned that there was some excitement around U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, and there was indeed concern that the act creates trade barriers, and there is also some discriminatory policy in that act, and because of we do have a good cooperation with United States, I believe that we are able to discuss and work on possible differences, and we have also created a task force on the Inflation Reduction Act, where European Union and United States will exchange on these issues, and I think that we will solve that. And on price side, we do have right now very difficult discussions with our member states. What can we do to avoid these excessively high prices that we witnessed in August? Again, in this winter or next year, we will start filling season again. And this is the reason why European Commission proposed a market correction mechanism, so that if we will enter to these extremely high prices that are higher than 275 euros, we will halt and suspend the online virtual trading platform. There are different opinions on that. Can we risk with the opportunity that instead of receiving these LNG cargoes to Europe, we will lose them to Asia? And what kind of safeguards have to be in place that this doesn't happen? And these technical and political discussions are ongoing, but I do believe that some kind of market correction mechanism for extreme circumstances is necessary. This is a useful tool, and all the other policies that we have put in place, well, accelerating renewable deployment, cutting our consumption, they might help us so that we will never witness again these extremely high prices. But in case this is happening, then we have to be ready to protect our businesses and consumers, and that means that in these circumstances, normal market functioning is not delivering prices that we can afford.
Yeah, right now, as I understand it, the price is around 220 or so. And so that a price cap at 275, as you say, is really to protect against catastrophic price increases, which obviously is critical. We're running up to the last minute or two. Let me ask you one last question. This has been great, but the energy transition. What effect has the Ukraine war had on the energy transition? Obviously, gas is going to continue to be important for a period of time, as well as other potential fuels like nuclear. And that, how do you see that affecting the green transition? Can we double down on both and make clear that gas and the energy transition is not an either-or opposition?
Accelerating the deployment of renewables is at the heart of our strategy to end our dependence on Russian fossil fuels. And right now, we do have in place some of the bottlenecks. For example, our grids are not strong enough to accommodate enough renewable installations. We have to step up on digitalization. We have to shorten permitting, and all these necessary legislative proposals are at the final stage to be agreed with our co-legislators. We know also that in this decade and next decade, we will need some gas, but whatever we do, we will not plan to increase our gas consumption. We will just replace some of the Russian natural gas with alternative suppliers, but the rest of it must be replaced by renewables. And of course, this might be also renewable gas, and there is lots of excitement around hydrogen. We have identified 3 priority corridors for future hydrogen production. One of these is also Ukraine. So we have committed ourselves that we will help Ukraine and we will stand by Ukraine as long as it takes. But then when Ukraine prevails and takes its territories back, we have to help Ukraine to rebuild its economy. And instead of offering transit service for Russian companies to transit via pipelines gas to Europe, Ukraine has a vast potential to produce renewable hydrogen themselves. So we can retrofit those pipelines, and instead of buying Russian gas, we can offer market opportunity for Ukrainian producers, and we will do so.
Thank you, Commissioner. You know, we could go on for hours probably, but unfortunately our time is up. So I want to thank you again for joining us today. I think it was a wonderful conversation. We covered lots of issues in a very short time, and it's been an honor that you were able to spend some time with us this morning. So let me turn over the floor to the moderator of the next session, Fran Burwell, for a conversation on mobilizing opportunity in Central and Eastern Europe's digital economy, which we're co-hosting with GlobeSec. So thank you again, Commissioner, and over to you, Fran.
Thanks very much, Dick. And that was a fascinating discussion. I think energy is something that will be key to the EU and our transatlantic relationship over the next year, and potentially much longer. I'd like to welcome everybody to this panel on opportunities in Central and Eastern Europe in the area of digitalization. As everyone knows, this is Central Europe Week at the Atlantic Council, and we're exploring how the US and Central and Eastern Europe can lead together in shaping transatlantic responses to global challenges. Today, those challenges are many. Foremost is, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has had impacts across the region and across Europe and the transatlantic partnership. But we also have climate change, an economy faltering because of the high energy prices that were just discussed, and the rise of extremism and anti-democratic forces in key areas, and the impact of authoritarian regimes, authoritarian countries in the global digital economy as well, countries such as China. In this panel, we're going to focus on the challenges and the many opportunities that face the Central and Eastern European countries and the transatlantic relationship and the nexus between those two in the digital economy. We'll focus both on growing the domestic economies of Central Europe and in building a resilient and strong transatlantic digital marketplace. This is one of the biggest, fastest growing marketplaces in the world, if we can put it that way. Europe is a place where American companies are investing, where they are finding their customers, and Europe is increasingly becoming a source of innovation and a place where US venture capitalists go to put their money. But now we're going to focus on Central Europe. And this comes just as the EU is in the midst of a major legislative push to regulate tech and regulate the digital economy, both in an effort to grow EU innovation and digitalization and to ensure resilient infrastructures. As we look at Central and Eastern Europe and what they are doing, I think we have to look both at the domestic, as I just said, but we also have to look at the intersection with Brussels and EU policymaking, as well as the transatlantic partnership. And it's great that to kick us off today, we have someone who has been working right at that nexus between Central Europe, Brussels, and the United States. It's a pleasure to welcome Eva Maydell, who is a member of the European Parliament, She is with the EPP group, that's center right, for those who are not intricate in the EU party system. She's a member of the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, otherwise known as ITRA, which is one of the most important committees dealing with these digitalization and particularly infrastructure issues. She is also president of the European Movement International, but for us, she is a leading parliamentarian on digital issues, including a focus on skills creation, supporting entrepreneurs, and building innovation. Eva, I hope you'll kick us off with a few thoughts from your perspective on what are the challenges and opportunities facing Central Europe in this area.
Thank you very much, Fran. Thank you for having me. Great to see some familiar faces, Tyson, Orsoya. Glad to be part of this event. I think it's quite important that this focus on Central and Eastern Europe is given. And I think it's a good opportunity to think about the challenges, but also the solutions that the region faces. And most importantly, how can the region take advantage of the ongoing technological revolution? And I think it will be easy to say that this is a region with great potential. People are lovely. Many of them possess sufficient and good skills in technology. And one could say the only thing that you need is perhaps investment. But I wonder how true that is. And I would like to argue that there are a number of other areas that I can see as opportunities or as problems that have to be tackled and that have to be fixed. So first of all, I'm wondering, can we have a strong digital industry if we don't have institutions that actually understand the digital processes? I think the digital revolution has also profoundly impacted how national, regional, local governments formulate policies, how they design and deliver services, but also how they interact with the increasingly demanding society and citizens. So, you know, if this is done well, if we support the institutions to design good policies, to implement good digital services, good digital solutions for the citizens, I think this could change, improve the business environment. It can reduce cost. It will increase transparency, and so on and so forth. We can go on. I think another point that's important to think about is that besides significant benefits and opportunities, the digital transformation has, of course, created numerous challenges to society. And some of those challenges are related to the digital divide. And it's really, you know, bothering me that, you know, it's more than 15 years that there was a World Economic Forum report on the digital divide. We are still talking about it, and we still actually witness having that digital divide in Europe. But we are also increasingly more faced with cyber threat, with abuse of market power, with proliferation of hate speech, with disinformation, and so, you know, I wonder, you know, is basically, you know, can we embrace those opportunities of the digital revolution if we do not address these particular changes that have happened? And I think my answer here is no, because I wonder, can the societies and institutions in the CEE region effectively address those challenges without being supported? And I honestly don't think so. And I do think and believe that they need the support, and that is both political and expert support to overcome those challenges. and to tackle them. And I think this is a task that has to bring together various actors. It's a task for the European Union, it's a task for global tech companies, it's a task for civil society, for think tanks, for NGOs, to support, to push, to navigate the process of modernizing institutions in Central and Eastern Europe so that they basically become equipped with the needed tools to create policies that would enhance the digital revolution in the region. And I believe that this is the basis for any digital success in the region. I always get reminded, there was a relatively recent report on the uptake of AI and coming from the US Commission on AI. And the first problem that it tries to tackle is skills. And we're not talking about skills of citizens. We're talking about skilled and prepared professionals in the national institutions. And what I'm trying to explain also, it's not related to the well-known in Europe e-government. That's such a 90s, or one could even argue an 80s trend. What I'm trying to explain is that we need to put technology to make sure that we could create those forward-looking policies that we could use, whether it's big data, and analyze it in a way, collaborate with various actors so that we are truly prepared to embrace what is already happening around us. And I think, no innovation, no technological company, no progress in that area can be started anywhere in the world if the institutions and also society do not understand the nature of this transition. If governments, if municipalities are living in the past, if citizens are skeptical of digital tools and digitalization, we would not be able to advance and to bring Central and Eastern Europe where we want to see it heading, and where today we're, and the panel today, I think we will address a number of these points. A final thought, how can we support that? Numerous ways, as I said, but let's not forget that there is 180 billion budget from the Recovery and Resilience Facility that is allocated on digital transformation within Europe. So this process in Central and Eastern Europe will be possible. But it's really important that these resources are thoughtfully invested. It's not about providing an iPad to school kids. That's not where those resources should be invested. They should be invested particularly for this digital transformation, to take the advantages of the new digital revolution and the transformation it brings around. And this is why I think focusing on building the public sector capacity and to educate society will be key for a success. And in my position as a member of the European Parliament, as a public servant coming from that region, I see this as one of my main tasks, and I would be very happy to get all the needed support from experts, from global companies, from stakeholders, in order to be able to help the process deliver in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Eva. And I know you only have a few minutes with us today, but I wanted to turn the spotlight a little bit to the transatlantic relationship, because you have focused very much on Central Europe and the support needed from the EU. But we're in a kind of complex relationship with the EU right now. And yesterday we had the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. What do you think of the TTC and its relevance for member states, particularly in Central Europe? It's not a member state organization. It's been run largely by the Commission on the European side. And how can an institution like that be something that is relevant to the process you're talking about in Central Europe?
Well, so first of all, there's a number of experts on that call on the TTC. So I would just try to give maybe my very few humble remarks, because I believe that the TTC is relevant for Central and Eastern Europe. And I think countries in the region should be watching the TTC closely. We have to be part of the game. We cannot be just, observers of the situation, because any agreed standard are going to be the standards for all of the European Union. Any potential opportunity should be an opportunity too for everyone within the EU. So we have to be part of that conversation. And I certainly, as an MEP, as much as it's possible, I have tried to do my part and continue to do so. But I think it's important to note that it's also in the discretion of member states to ask the Commission to be accountable before them and to contribute to the whole process. I think looking beyond Europe's borders and towards our global partners has, in my opinion, really a big potential for the CEE countries. I think for too long, tech in Europe has been seen through the prism of a few dominating member states. And I think we need to escape from that. It is also partly the reason because very often in the European Council, you do hear mainly from few of those dominating member states. And I remember that back when the UK was still part of the EU, the UK always tried to unite the CE countries in a common direction and a position. And now I kind of miss member states filling that role and taking that position. And I have always been encouraging that, there are wonderful experts sitting in some of those council meetings, and that they shouldn't be afraid to take that, a role in coordinating better the CE countries. And so, this would also be helpful when you look at the big picture, and the TTC can help us move away from this sort of tech nationalism and a silo approach, which is extremely needed also when we do legislation at the EU level. Very often in my latest negotiations on the AI Act or on the CHIPS Act, I hear colleagues referring to the US as Europe has to be better than the US. And I'm like, well, are we really competing with the US? We should be looking at it through a global prism, and this is where we need to work together with the US in order to be better than China and other states that are mainly autocratic. And I think Central and Eastern Europe has its opportunity to contribute because, as I said, apart from having nice people with good tech skills, there's also a growing community of startups and SMEs in the area. And I think it will be important that Europe trade and tech pie, basically, it's a global pie, and it's better also distributed within Europe.
Thank you very much, Eva. I mean, two messages I'm going to take away from that comment are that Central Europe should be not just a rule taker, but a rule maker in Brussels, and that there is a wider purview, a wider lens through which we should look at this, and not just, as you say, Europe always thinking about competing with the United States, but to look beyond and to see who the real concerns are, who our real competitors are in the global digital economy. I hope you'll stay with us as long as you're able to, but thank you very much for your time today. And I'm now going to introduce the rest of our panel. First, we have Tyson Barker, who is the head of technology in the Global Affairs Program at DGAP, the German Council on Foreign Relations. He previously worked at Aspen, Germany, where he also was responsible for growing that institute's digital and technology program. Prior to that, he served in a number of positions in the US Department of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. So had a front row seat at the beginning of some of these issues. We have Levente Juhas, who is Government Affairs and Public Policy Director for Central and Eastern Europe for Google. And he has also spent time at MOL, the Austrian energy group. But Google has been playing a major role in Central Europe. And so I'm sure we'll hear about that. And also Ursulia Raskova. She is the director of the Economy and Business Stream at GlobeSec, a leading Central European think tank, which I have to say has been a thought leader in moving not just from security, hardcore foreign policy and security, to thinking about the security implications of the digital economy. She has also worked at various entities in the public and private sector, including the European Central Bank, the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, and Saatchi & Saatchi. So a varied background. Tyson, let me start with you as kind of the outsider on this. When you look at Central Europe, what do you see as the main challenges to them reaching the next plateau or the next stage of the digital economy? And I guess a more fundamental question is, are we even right to be talking about Central and Eastern Europe as one block? I mean, how diverse is it? I have parachuted into some of the countries, and some of them are quite different from others, both in terms of resources and skills and even ambitions. So Tyson, over to you.
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, your framing at the outset was right to say that this is an area of acute interest globally because of the growth. And when I talk to big tech companies, American companies, when they say they want European experts, they say they want people with a background in Central Europe. And the reason is because that is where the growth is happening. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely a dynamism there. You're also right to point out, is this a block? And the answer is definitively no. I just came from Prague, which is, the Czech Republic is holding the EU presidency of the council right now. And their theme was unity. But under that theme was the subtext that you can't build unity right now with certain countries, specifically with Hungary. When you look at certain policy areas, be it on market access, be it on trustworthy vendors, be it on sanctions, on tech sanctions, there are still difficult questions to be answered. Cybersecurity, surveillance policy in states, for example, very different approaches. But I think if you look at the kind of what is happening in each country, there are certain trend lines that are consistent, more or less across the board. One is the growth that's happening. They're becoming much more digitized. Two is the realization that business model, economic models across Europe, of which Central Europe is a fundamental part, are changing, specifically because of energy as a factor of production. There's a need to kind of rethink classical, economic models that are based on old automotive sectors and chemicals, energy intensive sectors. Third is, they are all medium-sized markets with certain market segmentation that can only scale domestically if they are linked to the broader European digital single market. So completing the digital single market is a real priority for the region. Fourth is the question of, I would say the big four M's: money, markets, minds, and mentality. So the money question Ava brought up, how do you unlock investment? We're in a really tough place globally for tech investment right now. As the trend line turns away, interest rates go up, inflation. How do you get governments, pension funds, institutional investors to keep the dynamism going? On the minds piece, that's a common theme throughout the region. How do you keep, the talent in country and not going to London or Berlin or Silicon Valley? The market piece, again, all want to invest in, the digital single market as a policy matter. And the Czech presidency has done a great job in kind of driving that forward. And the final on mentality is, moving beyond kind of just the e-governance question or the question of digital infrastructure, which frankly, Central Europe has pretty good digital infrastructure, especially compared to the country that I'm in, Germany. There's a lot more ICT telco infrastructure in the region. So, but beyond that is how do you create the enabling environment for these kind of companies to thrive? I think those are the 4 points that I would bring up.
Levante, let me turn to you. Tyson's just laid out what he sees as what the countries, the governments need to provide, the issues they need to deal with. How do you, as a representative of a major corporate player in Central Europe, how do you see Central Europe? How divided or distinguishable are the markets? But also, what are the types of things that you see as priorities for these governments to focus on?
Thank you very much, Fran. I hope that you can hear me well. Not really.
We're having serious audio issues. If maybe you could switch to your computer. Thank you. And we'll come back to you. Thank you, sir.
Well, as always, the technology defeats us, but we'll come back to Levante in a minute. Ursula, let me ask you about the connection between security and digitalization, because GlobeSec has been such a player in having Central Europe think about its security. What do you see as the priorities in terms of how Central Europe should ensure that its systems are resilient? What are the challenges that have emerged when you look at the digital economy since February 24th, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Are there specific things that have come up? Is it just an extension of what was there before? How do you read this?
Thank you for the question. Yes, that's a very important point that you brought up. And some of these challenges were pre-existing, but they had been, we see them intensifying as the conflict or the war drags on. So one key challenge when we are talking about security is cybersecurity, naturally. Of course, this is not the first time the region has been experiencing cyber attacks before, but they have intensified during the conflict. And even in some cases, the world or the region was getting warnings that there will be cyber attacks. But the question is, when you're in transition, you're in the midst of digital transition in a number of sectors or public institutions, how do you build resilience against such serious cyber attacks in such a short time? So I think that's absolutely a challenge. And it's a challenge in the public and private sector as well. Of course, when you're experiencing cyber attacks, for example, on critical infrastructure, on energy infrastructure, that brings in a lot of issues which reveal the lack of resilience in the systems. I want to keep it very brief, so I want to bring up another issue that we have identified since the breaking out of the war, and that's the intensification of disinformation and propaganda, which was not new to the region. I mean, we have to say this very openly. A number of countries in the region have been experiencing propaganda, Russian propaganda specifically, but this has also time to time intensified, and it's a challenge because it is reaching different groups of the population. It is reaching, through social media, younger audience, but an increasingly different groups in the society as well, as more and more people during the digital transition became familiar with these tools. There is a bigger audience essentially on these platforms. So there is definitely a lack of resilience, and we have identified number of attempts, and not necessarily just during political campaigns or before elections, but otherwise as well. So, for example, we have come up with a couple of suggestions on how to fight this outstanding challenge. And one is, of course, awareness raising and education. that we need to educate people so that they are able to differentiate between a truthful source and the true message and the disinformation. And that has to be an ongoing effort. That's not just a one-time thing. It has to be an ongoing effort through, online campaigns, offline campaigns, using potentially individuals who are influencers, for example, to reach more and more people. So we see that this will be crucial in the future as well. I will stop here and maybe we'll let other panelists speak, but we do believe that these issues pose significant challenges to the region.
Thank you. Let me go back to Levante, who hopefully is not going to sound like some odd robot now, really to hear your thoughts on what the region needs to do. I would like to also put on the table the point that Eva
Yes.
raised about are the officials thinking forward enough? Have we gotten beyond, as Tyson said, beyond e-government? And are they really thinking in a way, and how can a company like Google help them move to that next level? Over to you, Levante.
Thank you very much, Fran, and good to be here with everyone. Apologies for the audio issue. So on the first part of your question, I mean, far be it from me to make requests or advices to governments, but certainly what we see is that this region still has, I think, a lot to do in really raising their voices in either European level policymaking or just themselves as a group of like-minded countries with a similar set of opportunities and challenges. I think that is true broadly speaking, but especially with regards to digital. And I find it interesting that Tyson, you have started your intervention by being very skeptical about the unity in CEE. And again, far be it from me to paint the grass green. I mean, the fissures that the Ukraine war has created on CEE coalitions is very serious. But then you have gone on and listed all the things that unites this region. So I'm still in the boat of very much saying that, yes, of course, it is a somewhat arbitrary grouping of countries. But I think initiatives such as the 3 Cs is very much spot on really trying to put the global spotlight on this region and not only tell the growth story, which is very much there, and I won't talk about that only to respect the time frame here, but only to again build the voice of these group of countries. So that's maybe one. I also think that Ms. Maidel was spot on sort of developing institutions and generally services that surround citizens. This is maybe a lesson from last year, but the past few years have been, I think, full of lessons after pandemic, war, waves of disinformation. But for example, last year we worked with McKinsey to understand the effects of COVID in many regions and many aspects. And one lesson that came out is that both companies, large ones, small ones, startups, but public institutions need to keep up with the heightened expectations of users who have gone online and really expect digital services to be there. So I think that's also true. But I would also like to just acknowledge our role and talk about partnerships and the importance of that, because I think that is ultimately the lesson for us over the years, that to build impact, to really scale what we do, and to scale some of the really fantastic things that NGOs are doing. We need to work together, and we are constantly working to explore new partnerships and then execute in them. This is true for our digital skilling program, Grow with Google, that has trained millions of people over the years. We're exploring to drive this more towards safety and talk about Safe with Google. This is relating to the point about awareness raising that I also agree is very important in the context of disinformation that Orshaya mentioned. For example, on YouTube, I think it's just a few weeks ago that we have launched the so-called Hit Pause campaign, aimed specifically for the TikTok generation. These are just 15-minute, very quick clips that come up and give very simple tips such as verify the source, look at other alternatives, don't make a decision, don't be cornered, don't trust the expert just because there is some byline, look behind it. So I think there's so much more to be done, especially on this information this year. I think this is the lesson of this year besides cybersecurity. But just to maybe summarize, so build the coalitions because they are increasingly impactful. I think 2022 has really been a year where the world has started to pay really attention to CEE and the voices of CEE leaders. Again, if I may be a little bit monopolizing the discussion, but we saw it very critical in the last stages, for example, critical policymaking procedures. The Digital Markets Act at the very last stages was reviewed from a security point of view. We have been talking a long time about unintended effects of various policy measures. And it was CE leaders who really put it on the table that maybe data sharing obligations very broadly put on global tech players is not the best idea when we don't want to empower bad actors. The same maybe goes for EUCS, the EU Cybersecurity Certification Scheme, which again, driven by good intentions, but might push out, I think, cutting edge cloud providers from the market and indeed from critical applications. But I think these are the things that are worthwhile to look at and where I think the voice of Central Eastern European leaders is critical. And maybe I'll stop there, but I enjoyed the discussion. I hope to continue. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Levente. And I want to invite our listeners to, if they have questions, to put them in, use the Q&A function. I've been checking that. So far, I've seen ones from the previous discussion on energy, but we look forward to getting some digital questions, and we'll put them to our panel. Tyson, I want to follow up with you on something that Levente touched on, but he didn't use the rhetorical flourish of digital sovereignty. So there has been this discussion, and clearly when you're in Brussels, when you're in Paris, when you're in Berlin, you hear a lot about how the EU needs to stand on its own 2 feet and to have systems and policies that make it immune from the laws of other countries. And I wonder how you see that discussion in terms of Central Europe. Is this, certainly when I travel there, I see it differently. I hear it differently. We're now a few days from being out of the Czech presidency. And the Czechs have been leaders in driving the discussions. They've had to, of course, play the EU presidency neutral role. But the next Central European country to be in the presidency will be Hungary. And so this also switches how Central Europe, the role Central Europe might play on some of these issues. So could you address that complex of issues?
Yeah, I'm going to give a positive and a word of a watchword, let's say. So on the positive side, or let's say something that Central Europe, I think, can really impact positively for Europe's relations with the rest of the world is to have a bigger role in the digital sovereignty debate, which I think Eva Meidel touched on this tangentially, but I'm going to say it very frankly, is completely dominated by Paris, Berlin, and Brussels. It's a very centralized, and it's a little bit myopic in that corridor. There's not a consideration of Europe at large and the equities in Europe at large. So getting more active Central European voices to play a role in shaping that discourse is really important because and GlobeSec is doing this, and other organizations building up the tech policy debate in the region, but there's more work to be done to build that muscle memory. You know, when I hear Macron or other people say, you know, we need a European third way, I asked, well, what does that mean for the rest of the world? You already have a debate in India about a fourth way. You have a discussion in Brazil about a fourth way. Are we going to have a fifth way in Brazil, a sixth way in Africa? And what does that mean for the kind of global digital ecosystem that is based on values that the United States and Europe share? We don't want to see that kind of fractionization. And I think that the digital sovereignty debate as it's currently framed kind of lends to that. On Hungary and what's coming, and you know, the difference in views in the region. I mean, one thing, if you look at the Digital Services Act, and we've been talking about disinformation, you know, the region is really cautious about ministries of truth because of their history. And you can see this in policy debates like around ACTA from about 10 years ago, where there was a big outcry about having government play a role in taking down content, throttling content, or having a role in basically shaping what kind of information should be out there. And the region remains cognizant of that. The Digital Services Act, which the Czechs brought across the board as a neutral broker, but this government in the Czech Republic has questions about how it's going to be used. And I think they're very legitimate questions. And I think that the region can play a positive role in making sure that the information ecosystem remains dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there was value in centralizing enforcement of the DSA in Brussels for some parts, because if we start talking about harmful speech and it goes in the direction of anti-LGBT speech, for example, and saying, well, LGBT speech is harmful, which we see in some countries like Hungary, then that's really a problem. So sometimes, getting back to the plurality of perspective in the region, we need to strengthen those voices, those coalitions that are on the side of greater liberalization, and disinformation is a great example of that.
Ursula, let me come over to you. You highlighted both cybersecurity and disinformation. What do you think should happen in terms of these? Do you feel like we are moving in the right direction? Or let me put it this way. You mentioned that you're engaged in or are having many more cyber attacks since February in the region, which makes perfect sense, et cetera. But are we moving fast enough? Is there enough resilience built into the system yet? Are the types of things that the EU is doing? It's just finished the NIS2 directive. There's a proposal for the Cybersecurity Resilience Act, for all the things that connect to the Internet of Things. Are we heading in the right direction? Is this something that this region will lead on because they're more on the front lines of some of these things? I mean, we have seen some serious cyber attacks on some of the countries, as well as European institutions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, to answer the question if this is something this region will lead on, I think the answer is for now no, because we have just so much to do, and our lack of know-how comparatively to other parts of the world or other countries, the US, for example, or some Western European countries. So we have still a lot to learn and a lot of resilience building to do. But I think we are on the right track. And by now, everyone understands the severity of this issue. So it's an ongoing process. And for example, quite recent attacks, cyber attacks in the banking sector have proven that this is a very serious issue. And it's not just one actor who has to be prepared, but it's multiple sectors, not just public but private as well. But within the private sector, we are just talking about so many vulnerable entities and players that we still have a long road ahead. And it's an interesting thing when we are talking about digital transition, to address questions, to what extent are people open to the digital transition? And I think banking is quite a good example, because in my personal opinion, we are still a bit farther away in terms of digital transition in banking as opposed to countries like the UK, for example. But, it's because simply the population sometimes, or certain segments of the population, has a more traditional thinking. Yeah. And, these recent attacks has shown that there is some justification behind it. But I just want to emphasize that, we have so much work to do, both in terms of digital transition, but in terms of building cyber resilience at the same time. And of course, this can go hand in hand naturally, but I do believe that it's a long process.
So let me just follow up. We have a question from Mark Schreiber here on the resources needed to better provide or coordinate services for cyber assessments and incident response, especially for critical infrastructure. EU countries, EU member states are going to see a significant amount of funding heading their way, most of them from the Next Generation EU COVID recovery plans. 20% of those funds are supposed to be dedicated to digital. Are there priorities, or let's start with Ursula, are there priorities that you all see that would help to spend this money to help protect critical infrastructure in particular from cyber attacks? And then I'm going to go to Levante to also think about this question, as well as a couple others.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. But because we are in a post-pandemic recovery phase, while we are also facing a war in our immediate neighborhood in the region, there are other areas that we have to think about. And again, here I want to emphasize the recovery. For example, small and medium enterprises are also badly needing financial support as well from these funds. Also, for example, the healthcare system in quite a few countries is in need of both reform as well as support from these funds. So I think that because we are in such a complex environment and in such difficult times where we have to address multiple challenges, I think cyber is just one of the many challenges that we have to think of when considering these recovery funds. And another point I apologize that I wanted to emphasize is the question of refugees from Ukraine. Which intensified when the war started, and then, dependent on the countries. I'm primarily talking about Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, that were receiving the highest number of refugees. Then it was less intense with what's going on against targeted attacks against critical infrastructure in Ukraine, as well as winter coming. It is a possibility of receiving more refugees. So we have to be prepared for this as well, and not only financially, but with a plan on how to receive these refugees.
Yeah. Let me turn to Levante and then Tyson. I know to see their views on this issue of cybersecurity and what should be the priorities in the Next Gen EU funding. Levante, I also want to ask you to say a few words about Ukraine and the thinking in major companies like Google as to what you will do in terms of reconstruction of Ukraine. You've had I think you had offices there before the invasion and have had to deal with relocating some of your people and keeping other offices going. So you could say a few words about that, and then we'll go to Tyson.
Thank you very much, Fran. So on the EU RRF, again, I think it's not for me to say how these funds should be spent, but I think they reflect a very correct understanding that the more digital you are, the more resilient you are. That is why I think partly why the Commission is earmarking such a high amount of the RRF funds to digital, and that we wholeheartedly agree with. I think the other maybe correlation that maybe is not as well or deeply understood is that we also think that security does not mean closed systems and being closed. Indeed, I think the more open you are in digital, to the extent with suppliers, with partners from like-minded countries and democratic countries, the more secure you are. We at Google like to say that we keep more people safe online than anybody else, but that hasn't always been the case. We have also, gone through a journey of how we have developed our cybersecurity response and systems, and certainly the latter was one big lesson for us, that you need to weave a certain level of openness and transparency into your cybersecurity response to empower everybody else. Never, never sweep any problems under the rug. So to this day, we release any infractions. Our threat analysis group, or TAG, publishes very regular information about the attacks we have, including state-sponsored or Russia-sponsored attacks. And I think the relationship between security and openness is also what your recent report, Fran, that you have co-authored, is poking at in a very well-argumented way, that what is ultimately at stake also in cybersecurity regulation, that cybersecurity is so horizontal, it impacts everybody else. We just talked about cloud, we just talked about obligations to large tech platforms. What is at stake is a global model of internet and tech regulation. And you cannot, this is maybe where Google's global perspective is useful, even in a conversation with national policymakers, that you cannot really defend a US or a standalone EU model in Brazil or Indonesia or wherever. What we need is a democratic model of internet governance that is a transatlantic model. And I think then all eyes are on the TTC, or that is where I would link this discussion back to, that we really hope that the TTC will be used to the fullest to really drive a shared EU-US vision for internet and digital regulation. But again, I digress on infrastructure. So yes, very important. I would also though caution that it's not nearly only about infrastructure, right? We're talking about products and services, and the other lesson that we always emphasize when we talk about this is the zero trust approach to cyber attacks. It's not only about building safe and high walls around their infrastructure, it's throughout. Like, security needs to travel with the user across the services. For example, I think again this year in Ukraine specifically, we have enrolled automatically all users into two-factor authorization systems, because that really helps, and we have also of course talked a lot about that. You also asked me to talk about Ukraine and sort of post-war. I must admit that I don't think, or at least I'm not privy to the plans as to what we will do after. The priority is still on keeping everybody safe and sound, and indeed we have evacuated most of our staff. I'm not aware of to what extent they have returned. I understand that business activity is returning by and large into Kiev, but what we can say is that Google is absolutely committed to helping through this very difficult period of Ukraine and the Ukrainian government. We hope to return to a safe and peaceful and sovereign Ukraine as soon as possible. And until then, we're really available. We have done a number of unprecedented steps across some platforms to fight disinformation, cybersecurity, as I just said, for all Ukrainian users. And Ukraine is a big country with a lot of Google users. Or, for example, we have rolled out Project Shield, which was initially a program only for NGOs and investigative journalists. What Project Shield does is that it uses Google's global infrastructure against DDoS attacks. You enroll into Project Shield, it's a free service, and then any malicious DDoS attacks will be sort of spread across Google's global infrastructure, and it turns out it's really difficult to beat that. And we have rolled it out for the entire, I think, for all the Ukrainian government institutions that asked for it. And we've been very humbled to be recognized for these efforts with the peace efforts that first Google has received out of companies. But again, maybe I believe, I think there has been a lot of effort at helping Ukraine in the first stages of the war. I hope that agility, that openness, that focus on partnerships, and the relationships that we have deepened over the months will help us to be also there at the forefront when we can think about what you just have referred to. Again, I think largely for governments to work out the framework, and as the Ukraine comes closer to the European family of countries, we really hope to be there and assist from the first seat as well. Thank you.
Tyson, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the needs for cybersecurity and keeping Central European, particularly critical infrastructure, resilient. But I also, as we get close to the end of our session here, I'm trying to identify some priorities. If we look at next generation EU funds, if we look at the TTC, if we look at what should Central Europe press in the EU now that the checks are almost out of the presidency. What is the next during the Swedish and presidency? What should be the priorities for Central Europe if we can identify them? What are the things that Central Europe really needs to think about in these, not just their domestic areas, but in their diplomatic, digital diplomacy efforts with the EU and with the United States? And then I'm going to ask Ursula and Levante this as well to wrap up. So Tyson.
Well, let me answer that question focused on cybersecurity, because I think cybersecurity is a great test case for different perceptions of digital sovereignty. So the United States has a doctrine of below the threshold of armed conflict of persistent engagement and defending forward. The idea is that this is a different domain, that it's an open domain, and it's one where you have to engage adversaries, not just in your systems, but in other systems, in their systems. So the red domain, the blue domain, and the gray domain, so the in-between systems. And they've worked, the United States military has a great capacity in this area, obviously. That's the scale that the US has and wants to work with allies and has been invited to work with many allies in Central Europe. So countries like Estonia, like Croatia, like Montenegro, some countries that have been under persistent attack, as we know from Montenegro, for example. And that is something that is seen as a net positive in Central Europe, but it's seen as a challenge in some countries in Western Europe, where they say, oh, well, access to our systems, we have to air gap our systems from the United States as the basis of digital sovereignty. We need to have our cloud systems delinked. And I think if you look at Ukraine is a great example of why that might not be the best strategy, because Ukraine had a data localization law in place for its government, for public administration data. The second the war started and they were under persistent attack by the Russians, they said, we have to move from on-prem data storage and processing to, systems that are much more secure outside the country. And I think that this is a lesson that Europe generally should learn from Ukraine. I will say one other thing about Ukraine. So one is tackling the idea of cybersecurity and digital sovereignty, given the threat landscape today. That's an area that Central Europe can really play a role. The second is to watch Ukraine's reconstruction and development as a digital services hub. So one of the sectors that has been extremely resilient in this war has been Ukraine's digital services sector. They have some unicorns. You think about Grammarly. We've seen the ads. This is a Ukrainian company. A lot of the IT talent, even if they leave the country, can still operate in the Ukrainian digital services ecosystem. So how can Central Europe actually take advantage of that to build a wider digital services hub? Because I think that the future of Ukraine is going to look something like the future of Israel or Taiwan or South Korea, where it's going to recalibrate around digital services. And frankly, this war is a great testing and training ground for that.
Yeah.
That's it for me.
Ursula, what do you think the priorities should be as we look forward over the next year in terms of Central Europe on their digital agenda?
Let me just start by building on what Tyson just mentioned at the end. I completely agree that the refugees or migrants from the tech sector from Ukraine can play a significant role in enhancing connectivity between Ukraine and the Central Eastern European region, but also between Ukraine and the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. Because, a lot of these very talented people have, for example, went to Poland and they started either setting up business there or working from there, starting to build relations, socializing, hence, immersing themselves in the either digital or startup sphere in the country. But when they return to Ukraine, they can use all these relations as well as know-how that they accumulated during this time. So I think that this is something that we should keep thinking of, regardless of what is happening, that we should build on these to enhance this connectivity. And in terms of other priorities for the region, I think that strengthening our conventional and non-conventional security or traditional or non-traditional security and military capabilities is naturally important, given that there is a war ongoing in our immediate neighborhood. However, there are other challenges as well. For example, and this needs to be addressed urgently, which is energy diversification. This specifically applies to the region, to diversify from the reliance on Russian oil and gas. And we should also use this opportunity to focus more on green transition, so that we diversify in a way that's in line and following the EU standards as well. And finally, I think that the CE region should play a key role in the reconstruction of Ukraine, given its historical experience, both economically and politically.
Levante, a last couple words on priorities.
Thank you, Fran. Maybe then just to recap, I think partnerships and multi-stakeholder dialogue and cooperation, where those partnerships can really find each other, I think that is critical. I think the correlation between resilience and digitalization and the similar relationship between security and openness, understood in the digital world and in the context of the strategic partnership across the Atlantic, should be sort of the North Stars that guide the thinking and the scenario planning for this period, which I'm sure we all hope will happen much sooner and not later for Ukraine.
Thank you. I want to thank our panelists. This is it for day 2 of the Central Europe Week. However, I also just want to draw out one thing, which is that we've spent this panel talking about the priorities in digitalization for Central and Eastern Europe, the opportunities and the challenges. One of the things that I'm taking away from this is that the invasion of Ukraine, horrible as it is also energizing much of Central Europe to think proactively about some of these issues, including disinformation, cybersecurity, and a host of other issues related to making their systems and their digital economy resilient. So let's continue to talk about these issues. And thank you all very much for joining, both the panelists and the audience. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow on, I think, day 3 of Central Europe Week. Thank you all very much from the Atlantic Council.